Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about one of the great men of history, a very interesting character, and someone who's a lot of fun to study, the young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I have here a biography, The Life of Mozart, written in 1846 by Edward Holmes. It's this beautiful Folio Society edition with the silhouette of Mozart there, hardcover, cloth bound, and it's got beautiful manuscript on the inside there. It includes a lot of his personal letters and correspondence, and I thought it was a lot of fun to read. Now, I should start by saying that I am a fan of music in general. As you may know if you follow my channel, I love all kinds of music, including classical music, and if you love classical music, it's hard not to love the young prodigy Wolfgang Mozart. We can disagree on who the best composers in history were. Some people like Beethoven, some people like Wagner. I myself like Franz Liszt. But in terms of raw talent and gift from God, it's hard to dispute that Mozart was up there. He was an unbelievable talent and prodigy who was composing from the age of like 3 or 4 years old, writing symphonies at 5. An unbelievable performer on the keyboards and other instruments as well. Could improvise like crazy, and apparently put no real effort into it. You know, I read in my, there's a great 3-part biography of Franz Liszt by Alan Walker that I highly recommend if you're interested in him. Goes into a huge amount of detail, and they talk about how he practiced 12 hours a day. Mozart apparently never really practiced that much. It just came naturally to him. Just one of those like rare anomalies who were just unbelievably gifted. So it's always fun to read about those people and learn about their lives because they had interesting lives. And Mozart had a short life. He died at 35 years old. So a biography of him is always going to be fascinating. I don't do a lot of biographies on this channel. I think this is the first one I've done, but I do read them on occasion, and they're fun, and you can't really go wrong with someone as interesting as Mozart. Now, the interesting thing about this biography is that it was written in 1846, which is about 50 years after the death of Mozart. He died in 1791. So it's a relatively contemporary account of him and what people thought of him at the time, and it's written in a very different style than biographies are written today, which I found very fascinating. I'm always interested in seeing how literary style evolves over time. The main thing I noticed is that there's no hint or attempt at objectivity in this one. The author is clearly a Mozart fanboy, and he is there to defend Mozart to the teeth, and everything Mozart did was good, and everything anyone else did was bad against him. The world was against him. He had enemies everywhere, and the poor guy just couldn't catch a break. So that's not how someone would write a biography today. You would usually see someone trying to be more objective and present both sides and all the faults and failings of the person they're writing about as well. That's not the case here. He's just an unabashed champion of Mozart. And in a way, that's charming, and it's kind of nice to have someone defending the person that they idolize and worship to the teeth. I think that's a lot of fun, as long as you don't expect it to be objective and you can take it with a grain of salt. I think that's kind of cool. There's also a lot of kind of idiomatic 19th century speak in there. There's a lot of outdated attitudes towards gender and things like that, which are, I find funny, recognizing that it's, 170, 180 years out of date. It's just interesting to see what people thought about. There's a passage that made me laugh where it talked about Mozart was courting this girl, and when he came back from being on tour, she gave him the cold shoulder, and he just refers to that age-old enemy, the inconstancy of woman, which you would never write in a biography today. It's pretty funny. So the style is interesting, and I think even apart from it being a biography, as a historical relic in its own right, is an interesting book. Now, most people probably know Mozart from the film Amadeus, which is a highly fictionalized version of his life, but it is based in some reality, and some of the parts of that movie you could tell were drawn from this biography because he touches on some of the things that happened in that movie. But it's also done in a very much more subdued way and not nearly as dramatic. The movie presents Mozart as very flamboyant and childish and kind of coarse, immature, and lazy, and all these other things. From this book, it doesn't seem like he was that way. It uses a lot of his own letters, which I find very telling and useful because you're getting the composer in his own words, how he actually wrote to people and spoke to people, as opposed to someone's opinion of that. And he seems to have been very polite and somewhat modest, and very eager to praise other composers that he thought were good. Not the arrogant, coarse person that you see in the movie. We know that Mozart did have a scatological sense of humor from some of the pieces he wrote and some of his other letters. We know that he was fond of billiards, for example, but not nearly to the extent that he was portrayed in the movie. I think it's a gross exaggeration, and nothing against the movie. It's a fantastic movie, well worth watching if you haven't seen it, and I love it, but just recognize that it's fiction. The other part of the movie is the main part of the movie is the rivalry between Antonio Salieri, a court composer in Vienna, and Mozart, who is this kind of upstart who's arriving. And Salieri is an inferior composer and an older composer, and he's extremely jealous that he's worked so hard all his life and can't approach the genius of Mozart. And it's implied or outright stated that, spoiler alert, Salieri had something to do with Mozart's death. There appears to be no truth to most of that. The author does talk about how Salieri is at court in Vienna and was one of the Italian musicians, and all the Italian musicians resented Mozart and were kind of jockeying for position to have their own pieces there, and he's listed as an antagonist, but they don't go into detail into their relationship. It doesn't seem like they had much of a personal relationship, and he certainly doesn't imply that Salieri had anything to do with Mozart's death. Mozart died at 35 years old from causes that are somewhat mysterious. He was commissioned to write a requiem mass by a mysterious stranger, which that is true, that did happen. No one knows who commissioned the mass or why, and Mozart was feverishly occupied with it up until the moment of his death and ultimately left it unfinished. That happened. In the movie, it's implied that stated that Salieri is that stranger. There's no reason to believe that at all. There's no reason to believe that the mass writing is what killed him. Mozart was convinced that he had been poisoned, but there's no evidence of that. They did an autopsy at the time and found no evidence of foul play. It seems like he just caught one of those 18th century diseases that they didn't have the knowledge of medicine to know what it was, and just kind of died from that, as a lot of people did back in those days. Not nearly as exciting as this murderous intrigue plot that are given in the movie. So the book is sort of divided in half. It's interesting when you're doing a biography of someone who only lived 35 years, what you choose to highlight. The first half of the book covers about the first 25 years of his life, and the last half of the book covers the final 10 years when he was mostly in Vienna, working at the court of, working largely on behalf of the Emperor Joseph, although not getting paid for it for the most part. It's fascinating how little these composers were paid, given how famous they ultimately became. And, a lot of these guys weren't really that famous in their own lifetime. They became so afterwards. But Mozart was pretty well known, and mainly as an instrumentalist rather than a composer, which is the case of all these guys. Bach and Beethoven were known as keyboard players, piano players, and organists, and things like that, rather than as composers in their lifetime. And Mozart, to a certain extent, the same way, although his compositions were recognized as being pretty great. I don't think they were as lauded as they are now until after his death. The other interesting thing about this biography is the priority he gives to various musical compositions of Mozart. So the things that we associate with Mozart today are probably most the short pieces like Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the sonata for piano in C major, Rondo alla Turca, those type of things. Those three pieces are not mentioned in the book at all. The author focuses on concertos and operas, mainly vocal works. He talks a little bit about some of the famous symphonies. Symphony number 40 in G minor and Symphony number 41, the Jupiter, are very famous. He talks about those a little bit, but mostly focuses on concertos and operas. And he talks a great deal about The Marriage of Figaro and The Magic Flute and Don Giovanni, his kind of most famous operas. In addition, there's a couple operas he mentions that I don't really know and I'm not that familiar with. They were apparently more popular in the 19th century than they are now. So I thought the priorities of what musical works to talk about was interesting. The author doesn't go into a huge amount of depth in terms of musical analysis. There's a few short, passages of sheet music that are in there. If you were able to read music, those are useful, but he doesn't go into great musical analysis in the book. It's mainly more focused on the life and letters of Mozart, his relationship with his father, his relationship with his wife, some of the colleagues that he worked with, and the emperor and things like that. Overall, very fascinating life. As you have to be a fascinating life if you're someone like Mozart. He's just so unbelievably gifted. There's lots of anecdotes. I went to the Berklee College of Music, for those who don't know, and I've heard a lot of these anecdotes before, but I think a lot of them originated from this book. But I never tire of them because they're always so amazing. There's one in particular I like where Mozart was just a kid, like 7 years old. He'd never picked up a violin before. He was watching his father perform in a string quartet with some friends, and after he watched them play it through, he said, I want to give it a try. I think I figured it out. And he was able to play the second violin part at his first attempt without ever having held a violin before. He couldn't play the first violin part. It was too difficult, but he was able to play the second part, which is astonishing. And just like there's tons of stories like that about Mozart in his youth that just blow you away at his musical ability, the things he was able to do that no one else could do. And so much of his especially his youth and adolescence, is dealing with people trying to stump him, trying to challenge him to do things that he couldn't do, and largely failing because he could do pretty much anything. So there you have it, The Life of Mozart. It's a fascinating biography. biography. I really enjoyed it. I like to read about great people who I admire very much, and I love to hear about their lives. This edition is really nice as well. It's a Folio Society, cloth bound, comes in a slipcase. I like these kind of things. They tend to be a little pricey on the if you buy them new, but I found this in a used bookstore, pretty affordable price. If you're looking for something like a high-end leather-bound or cloth-bound book like the Folio Society or Easton Press or Griffin Editions, I recommend going to a used bookstore. They're usually not very worn. They're in pretty good shape, barely been read, and you can get them at a fraction of the price you would if you were paying for them new. So that's a great way to pick up some good books that look great on your shelf and are good for your collection. They'll be durable. You can enjoy them for many years to come. There you have it. That's my review of The Life of Mozart by Edward Holmes. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've been Logan Albright, and if you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed The Life of Mozart, please give me a like, comment in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be sending you more videos as soon as I read more books. I'm always open to recommendations. Maybe I'll do more biographies in the future. We'll see. Take it easy. Thanks so much.